热门的话题。我们明天再见。
大家好，欢迎关注华尔街电视频道。本视频录制时间为美东时间7月16日。这期热点深度继续关注郭文贵涉10亿美元欺诈案，所有人都在等的陪审团审议结果，在这一天终于出来了。在社交平台 X 上有照片显示，和郭文贵所组织的运动关系颇深的中国知名前体育界人物郝海东夫妇，在7月16日这天也继续来到曼哈顿的法庭，等待郭文贵案的结果。根据持续追踪该案的媒体内城新闻界7月16日在 X 上的更新提到，美东时间16日下午3点过后，郭文贵欺诈案，双方的律师回到法庭现场。托雷斯法官说，我收到陪审团的通知，上面写着我们已作出裁决。随着陪审团进入法庭就位，托雷斯法官开始宣读裁决结果。第一项罪状有罪，第二项罪状有罪，第三项罪状洗钱有罪，第四项罪状有罪，第五项罪状 GTV 电信欺诈私募判决为无罪，第六项罪状无罪，第七项罪状有罪，第八项罪状有罪，第九项罪状有罪，第10项罪状有罪，第11项罪状有罪，第12项罪状无罪。在司法部官网上，检察官达米安·威廉姆斯发布的声明提到，流亡的中国商人及所谓的亿万富翁郭文贵，公然运作了几个互相关联的诈骗计划，目的是从忠实粉丝那里骗取他们辛苦挣来的钱，以便郭文贵可以在他的5万平方英尺的豪宅里度日，开着他价值100万美元的兰博基尼，或在他那价值3700万美元的游艇上闲逛。成千上万的郭文贵的网络粉丝成为了他的牺牲品，而郭文贵则过着奢华的生活。今天，郭文贵的骗局终于画上了句号。刚刚，陪审团一致裁定郭文贵犯有敲诈勒索共谋罪以及各种证券欺诈、电汇欺诈和洗钱罪名，他面临几10年的监禁。我赞扬本办公室的职业检察官和我们的执法合作伙伴，他们侦破了此案，并查获了数亿美元的诈骗收益，从而让郭文贵的受害者得到了正义。本办公室将毫不动摇地致力于起诉恶意和有害的诈骗计划。媒体 Mother Jones 记者 Dan Friedman 提到，如果特朗普获胜，郭文贵的支持者现在将试图为他争取赦免，但这并不能保证。我听说特朗普因为各种原因不喜欢郭文贵，而郭文贵的亲密朋友班农本人也勉强获得赦免。随后 Dan Friedman 撰写的相关报道提到，一个陪审团裁定流亡的中国亿万富翁郭文贵犯有多项重罪。在这次广泛的欺诈审判中，郭文贵被控12项罪名中的9项罪名成立。陪审员同意联邦检察官的观点，认为郭文贵自2020年起利用他发起的一系列所谓的投资机会，一家媒体公司、一个贷款项目、一个会员俱乐部和一个加密货币交易所，从投资者那里骗取了数亿美元。这一判决也确认了检察官的论点，即郭文贵与前特朗普竞选负责人史蒂夫·班农自2018年起共同建立的政治运动，两人声称旨在推翻中共，在很大程度上是一个骗局。郭文贵利用这个借口赢得了华人移民的支持和信任，然后骗取他们的钱财。自2023年3月被捕以来，一直被关押的郭文贵，可能面临数10年的监禁，甚至有可能被驱逐回中国。他在那里也面临刑事指控。郭文贵在中国房地产行业发家，得到了中国安全部高级官员的帮助。2014年，郭文贵的一位重要政治赞助人在反腐败行动中被捕后，他逃离了中国。郭文贵在曼哈顿购买了一套价值6600万美元的公寓，加入了特朗普的马尔拉狗俱乐部，还购买了价值3000万美元的游艇、豪华汽车和满柜子的 Brioni 西装。2017年，郭文贵开始利用 YouTube 和媒体采访揭露他所谓的一些中国政府高级官员的深度腐败，这引起了中国特工的迅速反应，他们试图让他沉默或将他引渡回国。郭文贵巧妙地利用中国对他的行动赢得了忠实的支持者，这些支持者在全球形成了类似粉丝俱乐部的组织，旨在支持郭文贵的宣传。从2017年末开始， 郭文贵得到了班农的帮助，郭文贵向班农支付了数百万美元。班农帮助郭文贵创办了非营利组织和媒体公司，甚至还有一家音乐公司，制作了以郭文贵为主角的嘻哈风格视频。2020年，郭文贵开始向粉丝提供投资机会。在他的视频中，他经常保证支持者投资他的项目会赚钱，并承诺如果他们亏钱，他会亲自赔偿。如果有人亏了钱，请来找我。郭文贵在审判中播放的视频中多次说道：“我会负责。”但这不是真的。检察官将这些视频与受害者的证词结合起来。这些受害者表示，他们在决定投资时依赖了郭文贵的虚假保证。检察官说，这些视频本身就提供了足够的证据，证明郭文贵犯有欺诈罪。引用联邦调查局拍摄的一张郭文贵用来进行一些直播的桌子和麦克风的照片。助理美国检察官芬克在周三的总结陈词中表示，这是犯罪现场。芬克说，郭文贵撒谎骗取他人的钱财。检察官还提交了证据，显示郭文贵将投资者的钱通过一系列账户转移。在一段由一名在不起诉协议下作证的合作证人秘密录制的录音中，郭文贵大声责骂那些不愿意按照他的要求迅速将1亿美元转入他控制的账户的下属。这笔钱来自投资一个名为 G Clubs 的会员公司。郭文贵公开声称他不控制该公司。你这个混蛋，滚出去！郭文贵用普通话对一名建议他获得董事会批准移师转账看起来更合法的下属说道。其他证人和银行对账单显示，郭文贵随后用这些资金购买了一套2500万美元的豪宅，价值100万美元的吊灯，价值97.8万美元的地毯，一辆350万美元的法拉利送给他的儿子，以及2张价值3.6万美元的床垫。郭文贵的定罪是在他以前的高级下属王艳平于5月认罪后进行的，王艳平正在等待判刑。另一名被控的同谋郭文贵的金融家于建明仍在逃亡中。检察官说他在阿联酋，郭文贵在2023年3月被捕前开始将业务转移到那里。检察官还将班农以及一系列郭文贵的其他同伙列为案件的同谋，尽管他们没有被指控。班农帮助郭文贵创办了一些属于郭文贵欺诈计划的公司，公开推广这些公司，甚至建议郭文贵如何设立这些公司，以避开证券交易委员会的审查。班农与特朗普的联系也帮助郭文贵暗示他的政治运动和相关的金融项目与特朗普有关联。芬克在周三的法庭上说，班农参与其中并不是偶然的。郭文贵，芬克说，利用了班农。他花费100万美元雇佣班农，以便利用班农的名气和声望来提升自己。班农拒绝对郭文贵的审判发表评论。美联社的报道提到，郭文贵，这位流亡美国的中国商业大亨，因批评共产党赢得了大量的网络粉丝和美国保守派的支持。他在7月16日周二被美国陪审团判定犯有多项诈骗罪。他被指控在多年间骗取了他最忠实的粉丝的钱财。郭文贵曾被认为是中国最富有的人之一。他在2023年3月在纽约被捕，并被控在2018年至2023年间经营一个敲诈勒索企业。在为期7周的审判中，他被指控欺骗了数千人，这些人投资了虚假的项目，而他则利用这些钱维持奢华的生活。他被判犯有12项刑事指控中的9项罪名，包括敲诈勒索共谋罪。郭文贵的律师表示，检察官没有证明他欺骗了任何人。在审判的结案陈词中，美国助理检察官瑞安·芬克说，郭文贵用狡猾的谎言欺骗他的追随者把钱给他。他说，郭文贵制作了数百个广播和视频，承诺投资他的人不会赔钱。检察官说，郭文贵告诉他的追随者，我很有钱，我会照顾你们。然后他说，郭文贵用投资者的钱过上了奢侈的生活，包括一个价值110万美元的乌龟壳珠宝盒和一些烛台，一个100万美元的吊灯，价值3.6万美元的床垫，一个价值4万美元的咖啡桌和一个价值25万美元的古董地毯。这些物品都放在他在新泽西州莫汉的家中。 辩护律师西达尔达·卡马拉朱告诉陪审团，检察官提出的案子夸夸其谈，却缺乏具体证据，话说得多，却证据不足。卡马拉朱说，郭文贵是一个支持中国民主运动的创始人和代表，吸引了成千上万的政治意见者。他敦促陪审团考虑郭文贵是否会为了钱故意欺骗他的同运动成员。他说，检察官未能证明郭文贵先生有意通过欺骗来破坏他投入大量精力的政治运动。律师并不否认他的客户过着奢华的生活，有一套占据整层楼的曼哈顿豪华公寓，康涅狄格州格林威治的一栋房子，一艘游艇和一架私人飞机。但他说，检察官想让陪审团逻辑跳跃来认为郭文贵有罪。有钱不是犯罪，卡马拉朱说，过奢华的生活或者花钱买好东西也不是犯罪，拥有游艇或私人飞机或者穿好衣服都不是犯罪。这可能不是我们的生活方式，可能会觉得奇怪，甚至让人反感，但这不是犯罪。检察官芬克尔说，大家都同意郭文贵是被中国共产党针对的，但这不意味着郭文贵可以借此机会抢劫这些人。芬克尔说，郭文贵还创建了一个黑名单，并在网上发布了他的敌人的个人信息。当美国证券交易委员会调查他时，郭文贵组织了针对该机构的抗议活动，并声称该机构已被中国共产党渗透。当一位破产管理人被法官指定代表郭文贵的债权人时，芬克尔说，郭文贵的追随者在管理人孩子的家和一所小学外抗议。根据媒体 Courthouse News 的报道，郭文贵这位自我流亡的中国媒体大亨与 MAGA 运动有联系。7月16日周二被判定通过反共宣传骗取了支持者超过10亿美元。经过约17小时的审议，陪审团最终在3天内达成了分裂裁决，判定郭文贵9项诈骗和共谋罪名成立，但在3项罪名上无罪。陪审团认为郭文贵在涉及中国媒体平台 GTV 的电汇和证券欺诈指控以及一项非法货币交易指控上无罪。他的判刑定于11月19日进行。郭文贵与前特朗普白宫顾问史蒂夫·班农共同创办了反审查企业 GTV， 两人看似关系密切。班农在2020年因欺诈指控被联邦特工在郭文贵的游艇上逮捕。郭文贵自2023年3月被捕以来一直被拘留。他被捕后不久，位于曼哈顿第5大道豪华希尔 Netherland 酒店的顶层公寓，在调查人员还在公寓内时突然着火。在过去的7周里，郭文贵在曼哈顿联邦法院接受审判。检察官认为他通过不断反对中国共产党建立了忠实的网络追随者，然后通过虚假的投资机会骗取他们的积蓄。检察官指控郭文贵在直播中对追随者做出虚假承诺，保证他们如果投资他的项目将获得丰厚回报，并保证他会对任何损失负责。郭文贵在一个播放给法庭的视频中说，如果有人亏了钱，请来找我，我会负责。但政府从多名投资者那里获得了证词，证明情况正好相反。一位证人 Jenny Lee 在6月告诉陪审团，他为了向郭文贵的企业，包括 GTV 投入10万美元，甚至为自己的房子办理了第2笔抵押贷款。与郭文贵承诺的高回报相去甚远。李表示，他最终除了从证券交易委员会收到的2万美元退款外，什么也没得到。他作证说，郭文贵偷了我的钱。郭文贵还向支持者炫耀他的财富，用他奢华的生活来诱导他们进一步投资。但检察官说，郭文贵实际上是用投资者的诈骗收益购买了他的跑车、昂贵的房子和名牌西装，使他的奢华生活只是骗局的另一面。他只是个骗子。投资者证人吴敏然在6月告诉法庭，他很会表演和欺骗。郭文贵的律师将这种炫耀行为归结为对中共的藐视。有钱不是犯罪。郭文贵的律师卡马拉朱在总结陈词中说，辩方认为郭文贵每一步都是出于政治活动，而不是赚钱的欲望。郭文贵声称，他因提倡被中国执政党无情针对，他的支持者给他钱是为了传播这个信息。郭文贵甚至从被开除的前司法部员工 George Higginbotham 那里获得了证词， Higginbotham 告诉陪审团，他与中国官员合谋非法游说特朗普政府将郭文贵驱逐回中国。这不是敲诈勒索企业。Comrade 说郭文贵的商业帝国，这是一个政治性的企业。政府同意郭文贵确实受到中国共产党的针对，但认为这与陪审团无关，因为这是一起诈骗案，这并不能给他抢劫这些人的许可证。助理美国检察官 Ryan Finkel 在上周的控方总结陈词中说，这个裁决并非没有困难。上周五，法庭在一名陪审员透露他在审议开始的早晨非法用谷歌搜索了郭文贵的同案被告于建明后，解除了他的职务。美国地方法官 Annalisa Torres 将这名陪审员送回家，用替补陪审员替换了他，并指示陪审团重新开始审议。郭文贵在2014年习近平领导的反腐败行动期间离开中国，该行动涉及到郭文贵身边的人，包括一名高级情报官员。中国当局以强奸、绑架、贿赂和其他罪名要求将郭文贵引渡回国。好了，以上就是今天热点深度所有内容，更多资讯可以关注六度简报网站，网址是6dobrief.com， 在上面各位可以订阅各类符合您喜好的简报新闻，有免费套餐，也有更加专业的付费套餐供大家选择。今天的视频就到这里，我们下个视频再见。
大家好，欢迎来到我们华尔街争议节目。今天我们要探讨的是中共20届三中全会能否带来真正的改变。这次为期4天的重要会议在中国经济面临复杂问题时召开，房地产市场低迷、债务高筑、青年失业率高企等问题纷纷涌现。中国国家统计局最新公布的经济数据更是给市场泼了一盆冷水。经济学者和分析师们对这次会议寄予厚望，期待通过财税改革、深化国企改革等措施来提振经济。然而，三中全会能否提出有说服力的改革方案，并在高压的政治环境下有效落实，仍然充满不确定性。特别是在历史垃圾时间的舆论背景下，能否打破信心不足的困境，更是一个巨大的挑战。请大家继续收看详细内容。中共20届三中全会在北京展开了为期4天的重要会议。7月15日，这一闭门会议吸引了全球的目光，因为外界普遍期待这次会议能为中国的未来指明方向，尤其是在当前经济陷入困境的情况下。联合早报在其评论中提到，大家都在问三中全会能改变什么。新华社发布的消息称，中共政治局已在全会上做了工作报告，并就中共中央关于进一步全面深化改革、推进中国式现代化的决定讨论稿进行了说明。根据往年的惯例，有关这场会议的详细内容预计将在全会闭幕后发布。会议结束时，决议讨论稿将获通过，成为指导中国迈向2035年基本实现社会主义现代化的纲领性文件。改革开放的历史背景赋予了这次三中全会极大的期待。自1978年11届三中全会掀开改革开放大幕以来，中共的每次三中全会都聚焦改革和发展，备受各界关注。这一次尤其如此，因为中国经济正面临多重挑战。当前，中国的经济问题非常复杂，房地产市场持续低迷，地方政府债台高筑，青年失业率高企，民营企业信心不足，消费者不敢花钱。此外，外部局势也不容乐观，中国在科技领域面临美国的针对，电动汽车出口等问题使中国与欧美国家的贸易关系紧张。就在三中全会召开期间，中国国家统计局公布了第2季经济数据，让市场更加担忧。数据显示，受房地产市场低迷和消费支出疲弱等因素拖累，第2季中国经济同比仅增长 4.7%， 显著低于第1季的 5.3%， 也不及多数经济师的预估。尽管已有提振楼市的措施，但6月份70个大中城市的新房和二手房价格环比继续下跌。数据一出，市场对中国出台刺激措施进行更广泛改革的呼声更高。三中全会能带来什么样的改变，变得更加重要。经济学者、分析师等在会前做出了多种预测，并提出了他们心中的改革愿望单。 财税改革，调整中央和地方财税分配，缓解地方财政压力，推进土地、劳动力、资本等要素的市场化改革，深化国企改革，保障民营经济，处理好政府与市场的关系，在一些行业取消外资所有权限制，改革退休和户口制度等都是大家热议的话题。三中全会预计也会讨论高层去年提出的新质生产力课题，并在决议中对其内涵和思路做进一步阐述，推动高端和先进制造业发展，引导中国走科技创新和自主的道路。可以预见，这次三中全会将出台一系列的改革措施，但如果简单的认为会议将放大招，或期待会议提出的改革措施能立竿见影改变中国经济现状，那就太乐观了。一方面，三中全会的任务不是解决短期的经济问题，也不会提出大规模的刺激政策，它要做的是进一步全面深化改革，而中国的改革已经进入深水区，需要的是更长远的布局和更深层的刮骨疗毒。另一方面，任何改革都需要时间才能见成效，这个时间跨度可能是3年、5年，甚至更长。因此，三中全会的关键在于能否拿出有说服力的、有连贯性的改革方案，也在于如何在后期有效落实这些方案，避免流于纸面承诺，更在于在政治氛围收紧、意识形态强化的大环境下，能不能营造有利于改革的氛围，扭转人们对中国未来的预期。最后一点也是最困难却又无法回避的问题。就在三中全会召开前，互联网上密集出现关于历史垃圾时间的议论，别在垃圾时间里投资垃圾时间，躺平才是出路等言论四起。7月初，一名毕业于名校、就职于中国顶级金融公司的30岁女职员，因为减薪、房贷、房价大跌等原因结束生命。这一事件在社会上引起了广泛讨论。金融时报专栏作家徐锦撰文指出，在历史的垃圾时间，管理失败是多数人需要面对的课题。尽管这起事件的具体原因外界依然无从知晓，但它确实触动了许多人的情绪，揭示了一种在大时代中的无助感和无力感。中国官媒和官方学者近期连续发文驳斥历史垃圾时间的说法，实事求是地说，历史垃圾时间暗示的是注定失败的结局，以此来评判当下的中国是武断和极端的。但舆论之所以有这样的讨论，并在很大范围内引发共鸣，背后折射出的还是被不确定性笼罩的迷茫感。三中全会将在星期四闭幕，这场推迟半年多举行的会议能否带来改变？它能不能破除信心不足的难题，打消人们对历史垃圾时间的疑虑？答案很快就会揭晓。在一座肃穆的苏式建筑中，一场政治大戏即将揭幕。没错，京西宾馆，那座有60年历史的建筑，将成为中国领导人习近平和其他370名共产党官员的作战指挥部。不对外公开的三中全会将从周一开始，会议的目标是审议如何让这个世界第2大经济体摆脱萎靡，焕发新生。我们可以想象，习近平端坐在会议厅的正前方，表情庄重，心中却可能有些小紧张。毕竟坐在他面前的都是党内的忠实拥护者，他们大概都会对他的计划大加赞赏。但真正的考验还在后头，因为这些政策和意识形态的变化将需要通过政府的层层过滤，才能真正落地生根。习近平的成功与否，将在于他是否能够重新赢得广大民众和失望透顶的外国投资者的信心。近年来，中国经济增长滞缓，房地产市场崩溃，地方政府债台高筑，企业和消费者都感受到了沉重的压力。外国公司对这个曾经的投资天堂也逐渐失去了兴趣。就在会议开始的那个早晨，中国统计局公布的数据更是雪上加霜，显示经济增长急剧放缓。前世界银行中国局局长贝尔特霍夫曼在本月的一次谈话中直言，很多不确定性导致消费者和投资者的情绪非常低落。现在是中国需要亮出底牌的时候了。习近平将这次的领导层会议三中全会作为他高质量增长战略的宣传舞台。三中全会5年一届中共中央委员会的第3次会议，曾是邓小平这样的中国领导人激发人们对现代化目标热情的时刻。而现在，习近平要用它来实现什么呢？中国有许多工厂，但似乎还不够。各省政府和国家部委忙着落实习近平的最新经济口号， 利用新质生产力实现更可持续的增长。要实现这个目标，当然少不了建设更多的工厂。中国生产的制成品已占世界总量的近1/3，但还在进一步推进。在这个计划中，中国打算部署更多的机器人和其他自动化手段，以弥补愿意在工厂工作的工人的短缺。太阳能电池板、电动汽车和电池行业如今都受到了政府的青睐，这些新兴产业正在取代与房地产行业联系更紧密的旧行业，如钢铁和水泥制造业。习近平的高科技梦显而易见，但他对外国公司和中国自己的私营企业的态度却有些模棱两可。当中央委员会公布党的目标时，这些企业都在翘首以待新的激励措施或保证。亚洲协会政策研究所研究员尼尔·托马斯表示，真正的问题是，这次会议将在多大程度上改变国家与市场之间的平衡。重振私营部门的热情可能并非易事。监管部门的打压使中国的科技巨头和其他民营企业元气大伤，让投资者怀疑习近平的经济计划中是否有他们的一席之地。自去年中国经济开始严重放缓以来，习近平一直在强调民营企业的重要性。然而，这些企业希望从党的会议上得到的不仅仅是鼓励。托马斯说，习近平可以大谈特谈说要为外国投资者和私营企业提供更多便利，但如果企业看不到实际情况有任何变化，那么这一切都是徒劳无功的。要让中国消费者开始消费，光靠美丽的口号可不行。除非中国能为工人和农民提供更多的机会和确定性，否则习近平希望建立在人工智能和自动化基础上的经济将有一个不稳固的基础。如果福利、医疗保险和养老保险没有改善，许多中国人仍将不愿增加支出，减少储蓄。几十年来，中国领导人已经认识到消费是个问题，但尽管中国取得了大量经济进步，包括最近大力推广电动汽车，许多人仍然收入和支出很少。结果之一是中国严重依赖海外市场的销售，从而导致与那些吸收了激增出口量的国家的关系紧张。几年前，习近平承诺优先考虑共同富裕，缩小中国的贫富差距，这一主题可能会在本周的会议上再次出现。5月曾向习近平做汇报的中国社会科学院经济学家张斌最近写道，政府应该把促进社会公正作为政策支柱，但市政官员，尤其是北京和上海等大城市的官员，长期以来一直抵制一项有助于平衡中国社会环境的关键措施——取消户籍壁垒。这种壁垒使得农村移民难以在许多城市永久定居，甚至城市居民也难以在城市之间流动。较小的城市已尝试放宽户籍规定，以吸引更多的购房者和年轻工人。然而，这些变化只是部分解决方案。医疗和养老金福利以及公立学校主要是中国市级和省级政府的责任。大城市提供的福利要慷慨得多，而这些城市不愿意为新移民承担这些费用。过去30年，中国在基础设施建设方面的成功得益于一种不同寻常的融资结构，而这种结构现在正失去动力。在一个许多人抵触纳税的国家，寻找一种替代结构是共产党面临的最大挑战之一。20世纪80年代，地方政府开始向私营部门出售几十年前被国有化的土地的长期租约，官员们用这些收益来支付建设项目和公共服务的费用。但中国房地产市场的崩盘已导致许多私人开发商破产。从2021年到2023年，政府从土地出售中获得的收入暴跌了1/3。修复财政管道问题并不容易。许多中国人买入房地产，认为这是他们为数不多的安全投资之一，并且他们反对在全国范围内征收房产税。目前，财政部一直在帮助负债累累的地方政府借更多钱。可能的长期解决方案包括国家政府分享更多来自各种税收的收入，可能包括对汽油或烟草的征税。变革的远大前程不太可能成为现实。会议将于周4结束，届时党的领导层将发表一份公报，总结其决定。如果以往的会议可以作为参考，那么任何详细提案都将在之后的几天内公布。习近平以前也经历过这些。他在2013年的三中全会上提出了详细的改革计划，但从许多方面来看，他当时承诺的经济和社会变革仍未完成。 这一次，经验丰富的经济学家正在降低人们对习近平将做出重大改变的预期。很多人对三中全会有很大的期待，希望再来一波改革，放大招。北京大学经济学教授姚洋上个月在对中国企业高管的演讲中表示，我告诉大家，这就是你们所想当然的东西。欢迎大家进入六度探索的辩论环节，我们从正反两个角度对本节目进行辩论，请出我们的辩论高手楚天舒、谢琪琪。
我是楚天舒。
我是谢琪琪。
各位观众朋友们，今天我们来讨论的主题是三中全会能改变什么？我代表正方观点，认为三中全会将扭转中国当前的经济困局，并带来深远变革。我们不能忘记1978年11届三中全会是如何掀开中国改革开放的大幕，把中国引向了现代化和全球化的道路。如今，尽管面临诸多挑战，但习近平主席和其他领导人有能力再次带领中国克服难关，走向新一轮的高质量发展。
楚天舒，你在做梦吗？当然，1978年的三中全会是个大事件，但那是邓小平，不是习近平。你看看现在的情况，房地产市场低迷，地方政府债台高筑，青年失业率高企，外部局势也不容乐观。就像中国统计局的数据表明，第二季经济增长急剧放缓。你觉得这些问题是开几次会就能解决的吗？再说了，光靠喊口号、建几个工厂，能让消费者重新掏钱吗？别忘了，历史垃圾时间才是真正的挑战。
谢琪琪，你的调侃倒是挺有趣，但别忘了，长痛不如短痛。深水区的改革往往需要咬紧牙关，刮骨疗毒。三中全会的目标不是短期刺激，而是长远布局。看看历史上的成功案例，像1993年的14届三中全会，它也面临巨大的经济压力，但最终推动了市场经济的进一步发展。如今的中国领导层明确认识到，只有通过全面深化改革，才能实现可持续发展，甚至提出了新质生产力这个概念，不是为了应付，而是为了打破现状，迎接未来。
楚天舒，你说的这新质生产力听起来高大上，但别忘了，真正的问题是，民营企业和外国投资者已经被吓跑了，谁还敢回来投资啊？你知道吗？根据亚洲协会政策研究所的研究员尼尔·托马斯的说法，这次会议能在多大程度上改变国家与市场之间的平衡才是关键。但问题是，过去几年的打压让科技巨头和民营企业都元气大伤。你觉得他们还会相信一张张空头支票吗？用一句老话说，狼来了的故事讲多了，谁还信呢？
谢谢大家收看六度探索。这是一个由科学家、经济学家、媒体人、工程技术人员合作建立的新型媒体，网友与六度 AI 参与合作完成各种内容，这些内容不能作为任何决策或法律的意见。这是一个新型的试验性媒体方式，我们希望得到大家的支持，修正错误。网友可以参与讨论，也可以向万能的六博士提出你能想出的任何问题。六度世界网址是6do world， 请介绍给你的亲朋好友。
To give the context, we're interested in whether Chinese popular attitudes about the current patterns of inequality and the chances of ordinary people to get ahead and how they get ahead in China have changed in recent years. And the context is that I started working on the general question of inequality and popular perceptions of inequality more than 2 decades ago. And at the time I started interested in this topic, it was commonly said that although China was growing fast and becoming more prosperous, but there was one very serious negative trend, which was China was becoming much more unequal. According to the Gini coefficient, a standard sort of national summary index, China started out with a relatively moderate level of around 0.3, because basically everybody was pretty much dirt poor. But by recent times, China is around 0.50, or according to some estimates, even higher. Some some indicators indicate China is a more unequal society today in terms of income distribution than the United States, which is the most unequal advanced capitalist country. And China has more dollar billionaires than the US does, and so forth. And at the time that I first started studying this, more than 20 years ago, there were constantly, it was said in China that this was a dangerous trend. It was common to see the claim that whenever the Gini goes above 0.4, China enters a danger zone for political protests and instability and possible challenges to party rule. So I started out by trying to conduct survey research in China to see whether this was an accurate summary of people's attitudes toward inequality. And the first national survey I directed was in 2004. And lo and behold, I discovered that this what I call the social volcano scenario was not true at all. And here's the 2010 book, which I published, Myth of the Social Volcano, which essentially said the respondents in the 2004 survey were not that upset about inequality. They thought in general that people could get ahead and were very optimistic about getting ahead, and they could get ahead by individual merit, by working hard, by having talent, by having more education and so forth, and that the rising pattern of inequality didn't really block them. And starting with this first survey, I was also able to do comparisons with other countries because we used survey questions that have been used in advanced capitalist countries and other post-socialist countries in Eastern Europe and in Japan and so forth. And it turns out that Chinese in 2004 were more likely to say that the reason somebody is rich or poor is due to differences in talent or differences in how hard they worked or education and so forth. They weren't due to unfairness of society, discrimination, dishonesty, and so forth. And they were also much more optimistic about people being able to get ahead in the future than these other countries. So, but nonetheless, people after I did that survey and published this book said, well, wait a minute, maybe this is just a good time and things are going to get worse. So and in 2009, I did a second national survey, and this was after the 2008 global financial crisis, which had at least some effect on China with hurting export manufacturing and so forth. And then a third survey in 2014, which again, by then China was already slowing down its economic growth rate. It was no longer growing at over 10% a year. And basically in those two surveys, I found much the same pattern. There was still no social volcano. I was looking for the social volcano, but it didn't. And in fact, in some ways, even though growth was slower, people in the 2014 survey were even more optimistic about their ability to get ahead than they were in the 2000. So to give one example that's maybe in Scott Rozell's slides in the second half of this presentation, one of the questions we asked was, 5 years from now, do you think you'll be doing much better, about the same, worse, or much worse? And summarizing the better and much better, in 2004, 58% of our respondents said they thought they would be doing better or much better, which is a huge amount. I haven't done this in the US, but I very much doubt that 58% of Americans would say that 5 years from now, they'll be doing better and much better. In 2014, 73% said that in 5 years, they would be doing better or much better. So the question is, what's going on here? Why were Chinese so accepting of the fact that their society was becoming so much more unequal? And the basic framework we use in the paper is one Liz Perry will be familiar with. It starts out with resilient authoritarianism. How does the Chinese Communist Party, has it retained its hold on power while other communist parties have fallen apart? And basically the argument is there are a lot of different factors one could cite, but the main one is just this extraordinary growth and improvement in the standard of living and every, food, housing, educational access and so forth. China has had a dramatic improvement in the standard of living of its entire population, pretty much. The rising tide of growth has lifted virtually all boats. It hasn't lifted them equally. So the rich have gotten even richer. But nonetheless, most people feel that they have been felt in these three earlier surveys that they were benefiting. Okay. So this has contributed to a performance legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party. In other words, the fact that the party has presided over a world historical improvement in living standards and so forth. By the way, let me give a plug for another book, not by me, by Wang Feng, China's Age of Abundance. This has incredibly rich statistical evidence about all the different aspects of people's lives that have improved so dramatically during the reform period. Okay. However, the problem is the last survey I directed was in 2014. Well, that's 10 years ago. And after all, a lot of things have changed since then, and particularly since 2020 with COVID and the further slowing of the economy and the perils in the collapse of the housing market and rising youth unemployment and so forth. And a little over a year ago at the AAS meetings in Boston, I think Qin Gao was also involved in the inequality panel at the AAS, but Scott and I were talking afterwards and saying, "Oh, it's too bad we can't do a new survey to find out how people feel today. Maybe they finally now are getting more angry or more discontented." But then Scott remembered he had ongoing survey collaborations, particularly with Gan Li and his colleagues at the Southwestern University of Finance and Economics in Chengdu. And he knew that they were about to start a new survey, an online survey, to be sure, at the end of 2023. And maybe they would consent to include some of the same questions that we had used in these three national surveys, many of them also used in these earlier surveys in advanced capitalist countries and other post-socialist countries and so forth. So, and in fact, that is what happened. They included crucially two different kinds of items in the questionnaire for the 2023 surveys. First, a set of questions about why do you think some people are rich and why do you think some people are poor? And you give a number of possible reasons and they have to say how important one or another is. And those include individual merit and human capital explanations like hard work and talent and education, but they also include societal unfairness and discrimination and different family backgrounds and so forth. And then the second set of questions had to do with optimism. And as you can already tell from the title of the paper, From Optimism to Pessimism, the subtitle, what we found was very different than in the 2004 to 2014 earlier surveys. So this paper that we're discussing today is summarizing how dramatically things have changed and what that means. And now I'll turn it over to my colleague Scott Rozelle to present the summary of what the actual findings were when you compare the 2023 survey with the three earlier surveys.
Okay. Thank you, Marty. It was actually, sorry, go back up to the top. It was actually, at the Asia Studies meetings that Marty and I got together, and we had just been doing a phone survey. I hadn't been back to China in 3.5 years. We were doing a phone survey of a sample we'd had for COVID. I mean, we didn't want to talk about COVID anymore, but we were talking about who got back to work. And there were so many rural people that hadn't gone back to work yet. This is March of 2023. And, the news was talking about 10 million urban youth between 16 and 24 without a job. Well, we were finding 200 million rural people without a job. By the summer, most of them had gone back to work, though at much, much lower rates than they'd been. But that's when I came to Marty and said, there's a lot of pessimism out there, and we decided to do this. The first few slides I'm gonna go through really quick because Marty basically has covered them. And because the motivation is exactly what Marty said, is when the genie was going up, were people going to be unhappy, and was there going to be an explosion of the social volcano, which was a myth through 2014. But in the meantime, just like Marty said, there's rising global tensions. There's COVID-19. There's youth unemployment, right? There's the rise of social media, and we're digging deeper into these numbers now, and we're finding that 10 years after Marty did a survey, as people got social media, they said that they're doing really well in life, and then they start seeing all these people that have so much more money than them. That may be one of the reasons too. Is we wanted to fill this gap. Had things changed, right? What's the current pattern of inequality in people's view, and how optimistic or pessimistic towards the future was going to be. So our data, exactly what Marty said, 2004, 2009, 2014, it was in-person national representative with Peking University's Research Center, Kemper, China. It was a fantastic organization that was right next to our Stanford Center there, and so I'd always go and see the people back there. And then in 2023, it was online. The sample was much bigger, but it was online. And as Marty told you, we took all of this. I should say we took all of this data then, and we made it national representative by gender, by province, by age, and by education. So even though we didn't get the perfect national representative sample as you do an online survey, is we corrected the data in the same way from 2004, 2009, 2014, 2023 with the most recent, most closest national censuses. So these are as close as we can get to national representative data. And so face-to-face interviews are Martyr, and online interviews, for us. And what you can see, the little boxes there are the different ages. Look at the orange and the grays for the age distribution, the gender distribution, and the education distribution. And you can see that once we adjusted it, it looks very much like what the world looks like in China today. So, and that's what we're trying to get at. So here's where we go. So this is what we ask. So I always tell the story. Marty's old one-on-one question, and I actually I ask a lot of these myself. Is do you know that there's high inequality in China? And the guy is wiping the window of a BMW, and he says, "That ain't my BMW." Everybody knows there's high inequality in China. And then we'd find out if they're rich or poor. And then if they were poor, this about a medium, we'd say, "Why are you poor?" And this is the survey that they got: lack of ability, bad luck, poor character, unequal opportunity, unfair economic system. So there's basically two main sets of it. So there's human capital characteristics of yourself. Why are you poor? And then there's characteristics of the economy out there. Okay. And then you'd say not at all, very good, a small amount. Okay. And here's the main sort of results of our study here. Right. And it's there you go. In 2004, 09, 014, you say, why are you poor? And it says, because I don't have a good ability. I'm just not capable. Right. And look at how that thing changes in 2023. It drops to number 6. Okay. Lack of effort. I just don't work hard enough. Right. And that went from number 2 to number 5. Education. You can see education is still in the equation in 2023. What you're going to see, though, is the percentage has went down. Okay. So even though it's still, very, it's high in the ranking. And then, oops, there we go. The other thing we said was the exact opposite, is look at here, this is 04 to 14 here. Unequal opportunity was number 5. Unfair economic system was number 9. Nobody chose it. Okay. Look at this in 2023. It's number 1. I'm poor because there's unequal opportunities. I'm poor because the economic system is unfair. Just this quick reversal. And you can see by the percentages of people that said a sum of large and very large influence. So this was large, went down. So why are you poor? People said, I'm poor because lack of ability went from 61 to 31%. See the percentages go down. And for the economic system, it went up. Okay. Then we ask the opposite. We ask for the rest of the day. Why are you rich? Okay. And you can see the same type of questions. And in 2014, I'm rich because I'm talented, also human capital. I'm rich because I work hard. And I'm rich because I have high education. Look at by 2023. This is for the rich people. The rich people said, even if I'm highly educated, it doesn't mean I'm going to be rich anymore. Okay. And ability and talent and hard work fell dramatically, while guanxi, connections, went from number 3 to number 1. Unfair economic system went from 9 to 6. And better opportunities went from 5 to 3. So you can see the same thing is that human capital has fallen, and the problems of the economic system have risen, right? That's what we're seeing. And then Marty had these really interesting sets of questions that he's already talked about, which I think captures everything, right? It's, why is there high inequality and you don't care about it? It's because compared to 5 years ago, how do you feel about your current economic? 70%, that's exactly what Marty said, I'm doing better than 5 years ago. It's only 38% today. Okay. 8.4% of the people said I'm doing worse. I think I'm doing worse. Now it's 27%. This is where we go back and forth. We say the volcano is not going to erupt here because 74% of people don't think they're going to get worse off than before, but it's going up, right? And thinking that they're going to be better off is going down. This is about in the future. So here's the future. 66% of the people said, I'm going to be better off in the future. And 47% only think of that today. It's still half of the people think they're going to be better off, in the future. And only 16% think they're going to be worse off. Okay. So, I think that we see this real change of the way people are looking at the economy. I've been in China 3 months now, and I've been to the rural areas many times. I've talked to many, and it's that pessimism. Scott, is it going to get better, right? Professor Law, right? Exactly. That I think that if the economy boosted up, a lot of the optimism would even come back. And as you see, it's sort of right there. Okay, so comparisons with past and future expectations compared to 5 years ago, big fall. This is for the poor people. Okay, so these are the poor people. It went from 78% thinking they're going to get better to 28%. So this is where sort of Marty and I would think that maybe is one of the most important, sets of numbers. And this is about 5 years from now. It's from 85 down to 35. Okay. And so for the poor people in China, the numbers above were for everyone. This is for the poor. Okay. And the last thing I'm going to talk about, in our country, efforts always rewarded. Look at the fall from 61% to 28%. Whether a person becomes rich or remains poor is his own responsibility. That fell, right? Nowadays, opportunity for people to succeed is the same for everyone, down to less than 20%. And given the domestic situation, there's still opportunity like you to improve. That's fallen from 60 to, less than 30%. So, I think that, our implications and conclusions, are basically that selected inequality. We replicated these, tried to do it as much as we can. But let me tell you what it is. I told Marty, we're going to do this in July. and we're going to get this done. And I want to see this. And the results came back so different, like you see, as Marty said, no one will believe us. So then we redid it in October, we redid it in December, and you saw the results here. So ordinary citizens of China aren't feeling as strongly that this current pattern of inequality are merit-based, as well as being optimistic about getting the future, okay? You can see it's down, it's not out. And, that's, what we're trying to say, is the volcano starting to simmer, right? Is the ground starting to tremble? It's certainly not ready to explode, okay? And so that's what we say here. And the results do suggest, however, that performance legitimacy accumulated by the leadership through decades of growth, that's what kept people into this system. Now that that's hurting, it's beginning to be undermined, this legitimacy. So I have basically got to there. I wanted to thank Marty for coming back and forth on us, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from the panelists and from Scott Kay, the other part of Big Data China. And thank you, Ilaria, for organizing all this.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Scott and Marty, for your fantastic research and for presenting the core findings today. As this is a Big Data China collaboration where we do try and feature path-breaking work and introduce it to the policy community and folks beyond academia. And Ilaria and I have written a feature about this research, which we'll be publishing on the CSIS website, the Big Data China microsite later today. And everyone who's watching can dig into that data themselves. We circulated their draft academic paper and our draft feature to several people who I consider my scholar heroes, people who do amazing work on Chinese politics and society, who, when I'm trying to figure out what's going on, I go read their work and I try to listen to what they say. And we're lucky to have them today at this event, which we titled, Is It Me or the Economic System? Because we tried to find a way to sum up the core question about what are the explainers and drivers of inequality, and whether or not people feel that inequality is just or unjust. What is their views about inequity? But we're thrilled today to have just three fantastic scholars help us analyze the research and the implications for China and the rest of the world. Let me introduce these three stars, and then I'm going to turn the floor over to them. Liz Perry is the Henry Rosofsky Professor of Government at Harvard University. She recently stepped down after 16 years as the director of the Harvard Yanjing Institute, and she's also former president of the Association for Asian Studies. That's the folks that held the meeting where Marty and Scott discussed whether or not they should go ahead with this survey. Her research focuses on history of the Chinese Revolution and its implications for contemporary Chinese politics. Jessica Tietz is a professor at Middlebury College, the Templeton Fellow for Asia Program at the Foreign Policy Research Institute, and China Program Fellow at the Wilson Center. And her research focuses on governance in authoritarian regimes, especially the role of civic participation. She has authored and edited several fantastic books, including most recently with Max Gromping, a book everyone should go get, Lobbying the Autocrat, The Dynamics of Policy Advocacy in Non-Democracies. And lastly, but not least, Qin Gao, who is a leading authority on China's social welfare system and the founding director of Columbia University's China Center for Social Policy. She's a faculty affiliate of Columbia's Population Research Center and of the Weatherhead East Asia Institute. And her research examines the changing nature of the Chinese welfare system and its impact on poverty and inequality. She looks at the effectiveness of the DBAO system, which is China's primary social assistance program, social protections for rural to urban migrants in China and Asian American immigrants, and cross-national comparative social policies and programs. Thank you all for taking your time this summer and today to join us to delve into this really important topic about inequality and equity and what it means for China. I want to start with Liz, because as mentioned at just a second ago, you have looked at the history and evolution of Chinese politics over a long time, where questions of inequality and equity, unfairness have played a large role in explaining the rise and fall and challenges of different political eras in China. We've shared the research with you and would love your first take on what you think the findings that Scott and Marty and their colleagues have found mean for Chinese politics and society. Over to you.
All right. Thank you so much for including me in this fascinating discussion. The results of the survey that Marty and Scott shared with us are entirely consistent with my own personal observations, including 2 trips to China earlier this year. Unlike a decade ago, there is profound pessimism about the economy and about prospects for the future. My own sense is that this may actually indicate something even more serious than a decline in so-called performance legitimacy. After all, Chinese communist rule has already survived remarkably for 75 years now, despite sometimes some quite abysmal performance. We can think back to the horrors of the Great Leap Forward, or more recently to the Tiananmen massacre. And the fact that communist rule has survived for so long in China suggests to me deeper sources of legitimacy than simply economic performance, important as it obviously has been in recent decades. But dating back to the revolution, the party and its leaders have benefited from a widespread belief that the party and its leaders were genuinely committed to putting the people's welfare above their own. Serve the people, 为人民服务. But the pessimism, the malaise that we find so evident across China today reflects, it would seem, a feeling of betrayal of this fundamental social contract, a belief that today's party leaders are much more concerned about their political survival than the well-being of the public. For some, that suspicion predated the COVID pandemic with the abolition of presidential term limits back in 2018. But COVID, I think, confirmed this disillusionment with the party and its leadership for many more, both inside and outside the party itself. At the beginning of the pandemic, it was widely assumed that the draconian lockdown in Wuhan, the intrusive surveillance measures, the health codes in every single individual's cell phone were all being done for the public good. But by the time of the Shanghai lockdown, many had come to see zero COVID as a policy that was designed to strengthen the power of the party leadership more than to benefit ordinary people. And so when people finally protested in massive numbers, restrictions, of course, were summarily lifted, further questioning the zero COVID rationale. They were lifted with no preparation. They were lifted with no explanation, resulting in horrific loss of life. I know almost no one in China who didn't lose an elderly relative in that period. Although the top leader himself remained silent, the ubiquitous references to Xi Jinping thought for a new era that we hear all over China, required curriculum teaching at every level from kindergarten through university these days, suggests that every policy decision is directly attributable to the top leadership. A colleague in China recently told me about another public opinion survey that was conducted there, that asked not exactly about inequality per se, but about a range of concerns that ordinary people in China face. Unemployment, real estate market collapse, competition for educational opportunities, pollution, and so on. And in the survey, respondents were asked who they blamed for these various problems. Did they blame themselves? Did they blame the wealthy? Did they blame poor migrants? Did they blame local government authorities? Did they blame enterprises? And then there was an other category, Qita, where there was a blank that you could fill in. And apparently an extraordinary number of people chose to write in the blanks for each of these things. And of those who chose to fill in the blank, the vast majority of them filled it in with just a single character, ta, him. So in conclusion, I wonder whether we shouldn't revise the title of today's event. Instead of calling it, "Is it me or the economic system?" Maybe we should be asking, is it me or is it him? But of course, as we know all too well, here in the US, in this moment of an election cycle, the Chinese people are hardly alone in becoming utterly disillusioned with their political leadership, past and present, increasingly suspicious of the motives of their political leaders in trying to prolong their own political longevity. It may well be that China is less of a social volcano than the United States these days. That's utterly possible, I think. I fear we do face an imminent threat to political stability here in our own country because of loss of faith in the political leadership. And I actually wouldn't rule out that this is a very serious concern in China as well. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Liz. That's extremely helpful. Let me turn to Jessica, who spends a lot of time doing field work in China. She looks at civic engagement, local government, central local relations, a whole how policies issued at the national level are implemented at the local level, local policy innovation. What's your take on the findings from the work that Marty and Scott have unveiled today?
Thank you for inviting me. And it was, I wouldn't say a pleasure to read the article because the findings were definitely not super positive, but they're really important findings. I think seeing that shift from the idea that inequality comes from individual attributes to structural attributes, not only does that redefine the problem of income inequality, but it also suggests different types of solutions. So I think it's really, really important research, and I'm glad that you've done it. And the things that I wanted to talk about, I had just two quick comments for things for you to add into your analysis, and then a more substantive or overarching concern that I wanted to share. So the two easy ones, one is just about the visibility. I found it really interesting in the report that you're talking about the rise of social media making income inequality more visible. So it's not just that inequality has increased, but it's just become more visible, so that people before might not have realized the extent of the problem. So if you're in a village and you're looking around at everybody in your street, you assume that that's how everyone's living. And with social media, you can see, no, people are buying sports cars, right? And I wondered if you thought, or if you had any evidence to support the idea that the anti-corruption campaign was also making this visible in a structural way. So just because social media shows you that some people have Ferraris and you're washing the windows of these cars, it doesn't necessarily mean that that's structural, right? But what I'm wondering is, with the anti-corruption campaign, this has gone on for so long, and it's been in every part of the system, state-owned enterprises, the military, local officials. And I wonder if people are seeing that this is structural and more visible through the anti-corruption campaign. So that's one thing that I wondered about. The other was just about the nature of these changing beliefs. A lot of your results you just showed sort of as number of respondents, which is fine, right? That sort of shows us these overall shifts. But I was also wondering if it's concentrated in any way. In my research, I'm seeing bigger shifts among the Gen Z population, sort of 27 years old and younger, and much slower shifts, if any shifts at all, among an older population. And so it'd be interesting to break down your results by age, by income, by party membership, these different socio-demographic variables that we have to say, is this a linear trend across the board, or do we see some patterns here with some people changing their attribution of why we see inequality to structural concerns, and some people still holding on to these individual attributes? So those are just two small things that would be really interesting to see what you find. The bigger concern that I had, or not concern exactly, but I think what you're finding, that this sort of performance legitimacy of this constant, 10% economic growth that the party relied on throughout the reform era, what your research is showing is that it's no longer effective. But your conclusions are really focused on this idea that the party has to expand economic growth and opportunities in the form of jobs. But I think instead that what Xi Jinping is talking about with his discourse on common prosperity is that old model is broken, that it results in this inequality. And so we can't go back to it. Instead, we have to go in a completely different direction. And so with his discourse on common prosperity and his unwillingness to stimulate the economy in ways that we've seen in the past, he seems to be suggesting, at least to me, a new social contract with the Chinese people. And this one seems to focus a lot more on procedural legitimacy, this conversation about rule by law. And it also seems to change the way that performance legitimacy is measured, away from just economic growth to one of good governance, or what he talks about as responsive government, right? Where the good government is the one that listens and tries to fix problems. And so I think that this is really important for your research. The reason I bring this up is that if this is in fact the new social contract, it makes your findings even more significant, in that we're seeing that your survey results showcase these important points of failure for the government's past policies, but they also point to a different set of solutions that might be in line with common prosperity. So instead of creating more economic opportunities, with some getting rich first, the party instead should focus on voluntarily redistributing wealth from private companies and individuals, what they talk about in common prosperity as tertiary distribution, and moving the entire system to one that's more focused on slow, steady, and sustainable growth. And so, as you started out by talking about, the vision attributed to Mao of equality, except everyone was equally poor, she would like everyone to be equally prosperous, but no one should be rich, right? And so that's a different type of social contract. And the question then, for me at least, comes down to, can he pull this off? So if this is in fact the new social contract, a social contract can't simply be imposed from the top down. It has to resonate with citizens. They have to accept it also. And this depends on two equally unclear things from my perspective. First of all, who do people blame for this inequity? So if they blame Xi Jinping and his policies, that of course would say that this might not be successful, this new social contract. But my sense, and I think Liz was talking about this also, is that they actually blame Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin and the past policies of the economic reform era. And that if you had done the survey, even in like 2018 before COVID, or 2016, even when Xi Jinping had only been in office for a few years, I think that you might have seen some of these similar trends, in that what we were starting to see is this idea that the reform era was good for certain things, but it was no longer working for regular people and needed to be changed. In which case then, Xi's policies for common prosperity might be well received by regular citizens, and they might support these policies. And then the second thing that's also unclear is, will voluntary redistribution and state-led economic reform that are in the common prosperity policies, will this result in equitable and comprehensive growth? And that's really hard to say because historically state-led economic growth has had clear limits. And, Scott knows this better than I do, but, historically this kind of economic model is inefficient and it's better for developing hardware than it is for software. And so I don't know if this will actually be successful, but these are two things that I think are going to be really important in whether common prosperity can become a new social contract. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Jessica. Well, I think it's good. Thank you for raising this idea of a social contract being revised and also renegotiated. And maybe the answers to the survey are part of the response to that new social contract that's being offered. But let's ask Qin Gao about that, because you spend a lot of time looking at social policies in China and how they're implemented and how people are attracted or unattracted to them and what works and doesn't work. How do you see the results of this data speaking to how issues that you look at are being perceived and where are things headed?
Thank you so much. So happy to join this panel to listen to the new findings and share some thoughts with each other and with our audience members. First, I want to applaud Marty and Scott and your colleagues for doing this amazing new wave of the survey. It's hard work, and I don't think we thought it was possible, but you made it happen. And sharing these findings with us reminds us all people's opinions matter. I think for a long time, we relied on GDP growth data, income and wealth data, but what people think and how people perceive the future matter a great deal. And I think it will matter even more in the future, as Liz was suggesting. So I thank you for doing this important work and sharing the findings with us. I want to share 2 points in relation to what Scott K. you were saying. The first is one thing that really stood out from your findings is that education as the core indicator of human capital doesn't seem to matter that much anymore. It used to matter big time. So I recall about 30 years ago when I went to college, that's the only thing that mattered. So the message our generation got was, you study hard, you get into college, you will change your life. More so for the rural kids than for the urban kids. But that was true for a whole generation. But that's probably no longer the case, both in reality and in people's perceptions, as your survey powerfully revealed. So I think that means a lot for the country because people will not look for education as a way for turning their lives into a different direction or for upper mobility. As your results showed, connections, social capital mattered more than human capital. So I think that's very important and probably more research can be done for that. Scott Roselle, you did so much research about the rural-urban education gap. I think for a lot of rural kids, realizing education will not make a big change for their lives. The investment in education will not improve their life opportunities that much. I think that's important for China's future, for people's future. The point about social contract is such an important point. I think a lot about this in my research, but also very much in connection with your findings. I think there are 2 ends of this equation. On the one hand is the economic growth. China, of course, saw the rising tide for so many years, which helped people in material well-being and also perceptions, optimism. But on the other end of this equation is social protection, healthcare, education, pensions, and Dibao, social safety net. So all of those increased for sure over the past 30, 40 years for Chinese citizens. But their pace of growth didn't stay in step with economic growth. the urban-rural gap of social protection, especially in pensions and healthcare, narrowed over time. But the gap remains and still will be there for a long time if we don't have serious fiscal reform. So my own research shows exactly that. Inequality is persisting in social protection as well. And that for people to have security for their safety, to know that they will have something to fall back on when they get old, when they feel sick, when they are sick. That's very important. So I think this finding is reflecting both on the social contract becoming different in terms of both economic growth and also social protection, not catching up. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Three fantastic interventions in reaction to this path-breaking research. Let me turn back to Marty and Scott Rozelle for your initial reactions, responses to the comments that we heard from Liz, Jessica, and Chin.
Okay, thank you all for your comments, and I don't have well-organized or clear thoughts. Just a couple of comments in terms of Jessica's mentioning of the Common Prosperity Campaign. I must say that so far I'm one of the critics of. I mean, Xi Jinping launched this campaign in 2021, and there were a few high-profile things that were done. Like requiring charitable contributions by rich entrepreneurs and closing down after-school tutoring and other kind of things. But at least since then, it seems to me it's a kind of slogan. And I think a lot of people felt China had become too unequal, and there should be a lot of changes to try to make it more unequal, and some of them are quite obvious, like, for instance, the hukou system, which is, in some ways, China is extraordinary in having rural versus urban being, in some ways, the primary axis of inequality. That's not the case. I mean, rural urban is important in America, we know, and these days even politically, but it's not the same as in China. And they've been talking for, more than 2 decades about, reforming and phasing out the hukou system. But it's only around the edges still, so at least I'm having a hard time finding a new social contract that people can believe in coming out of the Common Prosperity Campaign when I don't see much of anything very concrete coming out of the Common Prosperity theme, except, platitudinous propaganda in favor of social equality. That's very good. And I would say in terms of Chin's comments, that, and this relates a little to what Jessica said, I would point out that the efforts to improve the social safety net and spread the benefits started before Xi Jinping. I mean, he's continued them onward, but really, people want to blame Hu Jintao, et cetera. But in fact, a lot of things were being done in the Hu Jintao, Wen Jiabao era to begin, most of the major initiatives to spread the social welfare benefits, particularly to people in the countryside, but also to non-Danwei people in the cities and so forth, really began, and the rebuilding of the rural medical insurance system and so forth, they all began long before Xi Jinping came into power. So I think one other thing I'll point, I have a different paper on Xi Jinping and inequality, objective inequality, not the attitudes. In 2013, the State Council released a 35-point concrete program for combating inequality that included all kinds of things like introducing property taxes and so forth. And essentially it disappeared from view. So Xi Jinping went, he did some things, but basically the conclusion of my paper is that Xi Jinping did not do much of anything very substantively important to try to combat rising inequality. And as a result, China still has is an extraordinarily unequal society that they haven't figured out how to effectively counteract that, even though there are some obvious things that could be done, but don't seem to be politically feasible at the moment.
Scott Rizzo?
Yes, Marty. Yeah, Marty picked up a lot of points. I was thinking. I thought Liz's comment of that the performance legitimacy, is certainly part of what's happening out there, but it's deeper than that. And I think that that's like the most fundamental comment that was there. Very, very important. And I actually thought Jessica's comment that not only social media anti-corruption campaign, I think we need to add a paragraph. I thought that's very, very, very interesting. And because I know at least on the rich side, I don't think the poor people think much about that, but people on the rich side think a lot about that and how it's come down. And our paper is full of head effects. So we just didn't have time to go into it today, but these are really good comments, Jessica. I want to go back to exactly just reiterate what Marty said, but also from an economist point of view. If your social contract doesn't have incomes rising and risk falling, this new social contract isn't going to work. So whether we have a new social contract or it's the old a failure of the old economic performance contract, that's what's happening. When unemployment is up, when property prices are down, when consumption is down and investment is down and exports are down, social protection hasn't gone up. If you know, Jessica, and I'm sure that, and Liz, who's just been to the countryside, been to China and talked to people, people aren't getting paid, right? And people are sharing jobs on the service sector side. And so, I think that this new social contract has to take that into consideration. And if the rich and the poor are both being hurt by this new social contract, that's really where I think that they have to step back and say, we need this new social contract that actually, makes life better for everyone. And so I think there is the great big, and as Jessica did say, there are no state planned economies in the upper income world, and if China wants to go there, that's going to be the real test. I'm going to stop right there. Fabulous comments. I took notes on everybody, so thank you guys.
Good. Yes. Let me throw a few things onto the table and then go back to everybody and for comments. We only have a few minutes left, and we obviously could sit here all day and pore over this data because it's so rich. And I think actually scholars and policymakers will eventually be digging deeply into all the different kinds of data. Let me ask three kinds of questions and then ask folks to follow up. And it's okay if you leave questions on the table that aren't answered as well. So one of the most interesting elements that I saw in the data was about education. Because actually the attitudes and changes towards education were first seen in the 2014 survey, not the 2023 data. That's the one where the data began to change earlier, particularly amongst people who were trying to explain why they weren't successful. And it wasn't about education then. And so I'm curious about the education variable. And I noticed that my friends in China, who I still emphasize the education for their kids still study from morning until night. A lot of them still send kids, if they can, sometimes send their kids abroad, that people still think education is a very important route to success, and because they invest so much of their money. So I'm really curious about that one variable. I'm also curious about a variety of different kinds of policies that Xi Jinping might be able, or the leadership might be able to adopt regarding taxes, local government, ways to redistribute wealth that also may create sources of growth, particularly for consumption. If consumption is supposed to be the future of growth, not investment, then redistributive policies might actually be helpful in generating that kind of growth. And last is about the politics of this. I encountered in my trips a lot of the skepticism and malaise that Liz has encountered on her trips and in talking to people. And what I've seen is instead of people, outright on the streets, although, we saw at the end in November of 2022 in response to zero COVID, is people, quote unquote, laying down, tangping, sort of not working hard or avoiding taking on responsibilities, or what I would call laying low, continuing to try to do things, but avoiding attention. And also we've seen some leaving. We've seen some people trying to move their money, their people. As you know, the U.S. southern border had seen the most number of Chinese in the last few years, particularly in 2023 and 2024. So I think that we would summarize this in political science language as exiting from participating in the political system, which has other kinds of consequences, maybe for the type of capacity implementation. So I'm curious about other ways in which the Chinese political system could be affected, even if it doesn't result in outright demonstrations or anger on the streets. So those are sort of three queries that I had. Why don't we start with Liz, then Jessica and Chin, and then end back on Marty and Scott for a final windup.
Thank you, Scott. I guess, yes, certainly if we look at popular reactions, voice is not an easy possibility for many people, to the extent that loyalty is less attractive. We're seeing, to some extent, exit, but we're also seeing something that was referred to in the paper by Marty and Scott and their colleagues, and that is what the Chinese themselves referring to as involution, 内卷, right? The fact that people are not just tangping, they're not just lying flat. Maybe some young people are, certainly, but an awful lot of people are working like crazy to invest, particularly in education for their kids. And, person after person told me how anxious they feel because of the competitiveness of this involution, that the state is not really there for them. The opportunities are dwindling. The demographic crisis is creating enormous pressure. And so rather than going out and spend on the consumer society that the regime might like to see flourishing, they're investing everything in their kids and in their education. So I think that it's not simply exit, but a sense of trying to figure out how to game the system, but in ways that are involuted and that are not really economically productive for the overall system.
Thanks. Jessica?
I just wanted to say one thing about the common prosperity policies. What we're seeing is a similar process that Xi undertook with the Belts and Roads Initiative. So he didn't come up with the Belts and Road Initiative. Most of the investments sort of predated, 2012, 2013. And even a lot of the big policies that he's announced were already underway or under negotiation. What he seems to be doing with common prosperity is a similar process of taking the policies that Hu tried to roll out but was ineffective, and he's actually making those policies effective and calling them common prosperity. So that's sort of a pulling in of old policies, a rebranding, but also changing the way that they're being enacted in such a way that they're more effective. We see this in sort of the Go West policies and the urbanization policies, that these have become much more rapid and effective. We also see this in the poverty alleviation campaign. This was part of Common Prosperity. It was one of its big keynote policies. But also really interestingly, in what I study, looking at civil society, the new charity law will go into effect in September. It has been completely rewritten to include tax benefits for donations, including for wealthy families and wealthy companies to come up with what's called a charitable trust. It's a brand new concept in China. That a lot of the legislation in this new charity law had to figure out who is the trustee, what powers and responsibilities do they have, what is a charitable trust? Is it just money laundering or is it something more significant? These are some really big policies from my way of thinking. The ability to move money around through tertiary distribution in a way that the tax system is being rewritten to support. So I know it might not be super flashy yet, but I do think there is something there to common prosperity. And I just wanted to point that out. And for what Scott said, both Scotts actually, Scott Rozelle said, if there isn't growth in this social contract, is it really useful? And then Scott Kennedy talked about, this new generation maybe exiting the system or lying flat. And I guess what would be interesting is if you could pull apart your survey data by income, especially if you have parents' income, it'd be interesting to see if those trends are different. Because what I'm seeing in a lot of the research I'm looking at with the Gen Z cohort, as far as volunteering and donation, but also we've been asking these questions about what is a meaningful life? What do you think a life of meaning is? And what we're finding is that all of them are saying no 996, right? We're not going to work all the time just to earn some money. That money by itself is not meaningful. And that what the COVID experience, where they were sacrificing their college careers and their social lives for elderly people in their community, part of what that showed them was that there's something more to life. There can be something more than just earning a wage. And so I'm seeing this really big shift in people saying that what matters is that everybody is taken care of and that they're willing to sacrifice income for things like environmental protection, or in our surveys, we find a lot of support for left behind children and reallocating resources to that demographic. So I think that the social contract might be changing not just from Xi's conceptualization, but also in response to this new generation and what they think is a meaningful life.
Thank you. Chin?
Sure, thank you. Briefly, I want to say this is a critical moment. Both these findings are very sobering, but also COVID, many other things that's been happening are very sobering. So it's a soul-searching moment for the Chinese leadership. I think we have a full menu of what could be done to improve the well-being, narrow inequality, make people to have faith and believe in the future again, but it takes political will, whether there is political will to address these issues or whether the political will is elsewhere. I think that's the critical question. Yeah, I'll stop here. Thank you.
Right. Marty and Scott, give you guys a final word before I wrap things up.
Just a couple of things. This paper was intended mainly as an overview of the general patterns. So it's possible we could get our colleagues to do some more analyses. There are a couple of appendix tables in the paper that do separate people by income, but we really don't comment on those. But back to how the system is operating and how it seems to be stalled and not able to do things that are obviously need being done to promote greater equality. I think back to another paper that was given at the AAS meetings a year ago by Andy Walder, another Stanford colleague, which was then published in the China Journal. And basically he points out that one of the major obstacles in China is their lousy fiscal system and the taxes. The Chinese state finances, the taxation system, do not redistribute almost at all. There's more redistribution from the rich to the poor in America and in Russia than there is in China. They really need to fundamentally, if they're going to have funds to do things like improve rural education, to pay for the costs of educating migrant kids in the biggest cities and all these other kind of things, they've got to have a fiscal system that's designed to do it. And at the moment, the fiscal system just makes these things almost impossible.
Scott Rozelle?
Yeah, I'm very much looking forward to the upcoming third plenum and going to be taking notes. Are we going to see a slew of policies like Jessica was talking about rolled out, or are we going to see new key productive forces, which that's all anybody talks about in the government, and that's all anybody talks about in the local government, and that's all anybody talks about in the companies. And that means having massive investment into high-tech automation, robots. And guess what is, we're going to have 300 million rural people without jobs. To me, one of the most basic common prosperity policies that can be going. I've been trying to lecture on this and talk to people about this in my last 3 months here, is we need rural unemployment insurance. Right now, no rural people are ever unemployed because they always have a farm to go back to. But people under 40 who have a rural hukou work on the farm, and when they lose their job, and they're losing their job in the property sector, in the manufacturing sector, what do, right? I mean, they don't have any source of support as they go try to find another job, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that it's going to be interesting to see where we go from here. I think it's Gene, you said it best. This is at a critical moment, and I'm looking forward to doing this again in a while. Scott K, you and Ilaria, thank you. I thought it was very, very interesting. We're gonna have to rewrite our paper, Marty.
Oh no!
With all these
Not yet. No.
Oh no!
You just need to write another paper. That's what.
Good idea.
So,
thank you.
This
everybody.
is the research that you all and your colleagues presented and shared with us, and we really appreciate the opportunity for Big Data China to be a platform for this data to be initially presented as a first cut to the global community, shows that the stakes are very high. This isn't just about trying to get growth faster again. It is about trying to figure out how China in a different period can continue to gain popular support and address the kind of challenges that people believe need to be addressed so that they can have productive, successful lives, however they define the meaning of those lives. That is very, very difficult for any country to make that kind of transition, and certainly one the scale of China that it's gone through, and also the way its politics are structured, and the political economy of who has more or less power makes it extremely difficult, despite all of the levers of power and sources that the leadership and the government have. This is no easy task. It isn't absolutely impossible, but gosh, I wouldn't want this in my inbox for having to solve. It is, and so we'll be watching the third plenum, but not just the third plenum, how these things are implemented and how people respond, because it's not just what is in speeches and in documents, but it's what happens in the daily lives of average Chinese and how they react to all of this.
想成为全球沟通达人吗？六度人工智能语音克隆技术帮你实现梦想。在这个新时代，语言障碍已成过去，我们隆重推出六度人工智能语音克隆系统。 这项由欧美亚顶尖专家研发的突破性技术，让你可以克隆自己的声音，并将文字转换成145种语言和方言，提升你的个人和职业生活。想象一下，你可以在日本参加商务会议，在巴西上课，或与意大利的朋友畅聊，而这一切都用你自己的声音、他们的语言进行。操作简单，只需点击几下，无需复杂的科技知识，就能享受无缝衔接的体验，让世界向你敞开。从商务到教育，从媒体到娱乐，应用场景无处不在。企业可以更好地与全球客户建立联系，教育机构可以提供多语言学习，媒体可以创作更丰富的内容，触达更广泛的受众。今天就来体验这项革命性技术吧。访问：迈向你的声音无国界的未来。
欢迎来到6度解析，新闻背后的多维思考，带你洞悉头条背后的世界。在今日华尔街频道的6度解析中，我们将深入探究时事热点，为你揭开新闻背后的真相。在这个信息泛滥、真相难觅的时代，6度解析应运而生。我运用海量数据、人工智能整合以及专家观点，层层剥析每个故事，通过实时背景数据挖掘，确保你获得全面的新闻资讯。然而，我们关注的不仅仅是数据，更重要的是将它们串联起来。我将分析多方视角，揭示隐藏的脉络，为你提供单一媒体常常忽略的背景信息。无论是政治、经济，还是全球事务，我都将为你带来最具洞察力的分析。试想一下，拥有洞悉全局的能力，做出明智的决策，参与有意义的讨论，这就是6度解析带给你的价值。它不仅仅是新闻分析，更是一种赋能的工具。加入今日华尔街的6度解析，共同探索头条背后的故事。你通往深度理解的旅程，从这里开始。不要只是阅读新闻，要解码新闻，理解新闻，活出新闻。这一切尽在6度解析。立即订阅，不错过任何真知灼见。因为了解真相仅仅是个开始。